A machine gun is meant to erase people. Put 3 of them on a hillside, and no one is supposed to get through. Yet one man did, not by charging, not by shooting faster, but by moving so slowly the system could not see him. In less than an hour, the guns went silent. 40 men walked forward unharmed, and a battlefield designed to kill became useless. This is not a story about courage. It is a story about what happens when war meets the wrong kind of human. If you're here to understand how wars really work beyond weapons and explosions, to understand why everything that followed was even possible, we need to understand the kind of battlefield this was meant to be. Not emotionally, mechanically. Hill 424 was not just high ground, it was geometry turned into doctrine. A slope steep enough to slow movement, barren enough to remove concealment, and segmented just enough to channel attackers into predictable paths. From above, the hillside looked simple. From below, it was a controlled environment designed to kill. German defensive doctrine in 1943 revolved around one core principle. Crew-served weapons decide battles, not individual soldiers. Rifles were noise. Machine guns were control. The MG-34 was not simply a weapon. It was the anchor of the entire system. Light enough to be repositioned, fast enough to dominate open ground, and flexible enough to provide interlocking fire. It allowed small units to pin, bleed, and stall forces many times their size. Once placed correctly, the machine gun dictated where the enemy could exist. On Hill 424, 3 MG positions did exactly that. Their fields of fire overlapped horizontally across the slope, not vertically. This mattered. Vertical coverage punished climbers. Horizontal coverage punished movement. Any attempt to rush uphill would be cut down long before momentum could build. Any attempt to crawl too quickly would trigger bursts timed to movement, not to targets. The guns did not hunt. They waited. Below them, the American infantry experienced what Doctrine intended. Attempts to advance failed almost immediately. Men were not dying because they were reckless. They were dying because the system did not allow alternatives. You either stayed still and survived temporarily, or you moved and were erased. This is the kind of battlefield where courage becomes irrelevant. Bravery does not create openings. Only artillery does. That was the plan. Locate the machine guns. Call in fire. Let steel solve what flesh could not. This was not cowardice. It was logic. Modern war relies on replacing individual initiative with overwhelming force, because overwhelming force is reliable. Individuals are not. And yet, the system on Hill 424 contained a quiet assumption that no one questioned. It assumed that anyone moving uphill would behave like an infantryman trained by Doctrine, fast when advancing, low but not invisible, focused on distance gained rather than time spent unseen. The guns were calibrated to punish speed and exposure, not patience and delay. This is where the battlefield became vulnerable. The MG-34's greatest strength was also its weakness. It operated on rhythm. Bursts, pauses, traverse, repeat. The crew did not need to see a man clearly. They only needed to fire where a man was likely to be. That likelihood was based on expectation. Expectation was based on experience. Experience was based on doctrine. On paper, the hillside was sealed. In reality, it was only sealed against the kind of enemy the system expected. Terrain reinforced this illusion of control. The stone terraces built centuries earlier for farming were never meant to be fortifications. They were uneven, fragmented, and too low to stop bullets. But they created micro-horizons, lines where visibility broke. Small pockets where movement disappeared momentarily. For someone moving normally, they offered little protection. For someone moving abnormally slowly, they offered something else entirely: time. The machine gun crews did not scan for stillness. Stillness was assumed to mean death or absence. They scanned for motion. Motion was danger. This was efficient. It conserved ammunition. It reduced fatigue. It aligned perfectly with Doctrine. What Doctrine did not account for was someone willing to treat minutes like meters. From the American perspective below, Hill 424 looked like a wall. From the German perspective above, it looked like a machine operating exactly as designed. Neither side could see the flaw because neither side was looking for it. The system was working too well to question itself. This is why the next phase of the story is not about courage, but about mismatch. The man who would expose the weakness did not approach the hill as a battlefield problem. He approached it as a terrain problem. Not how to defeat the guns, but how to exist where the guns believed existence was impossible. He did not think in terms of advancing units or suppressive fire. He thought in terms of angles, pauses, and patterns. The same way one learns where animals move when they believe they are unseen. This is critical to understand, because it explains why command decisions made sense at the time. From a doctrinal viewpoint, sending one man forward without fire support bordered on insanity. From a systemic viewpoint, it was unnecessary. The guns would eventually be destroyed by artillery. Time was on the defender's side, except time was also the variable the system misunderstood. Every minute that passed before dawn shifted the balance. Darkness protected movement. Light exposed it. The defenders relied on daylight to finalize control. The attackers relied on darkness to avoid annihilation. The system assumed daylight would arrive before any meaningful change occurred. That assumption would prove false. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was an interaction between two logics operating on incompatible timelines. One relied on dominance through repetition. The other relied on survival through deviation. The hillside became the testing ground for which logic could adapt faster. The guns were powerful. The positions were correct. The doctrine was sound. And yet, the system had no answer prepared for someone who did not behave like a unit, did not value speed, and did not attempt to win quickly. By the time the flaw became visible, it would already be too late to correct it. Because systems built to control humans rarely know how to respond when a human refuses to behave like one. What entered the system at that moment was not courage, and it was not defiance. It was incompatibility. The man who began moving up the slope did not carry with him a different weapon, but a different internal clock. Military training teaches speed because speed reduces exposure. It teaches aggression because hesitation creates targets. It teaches synchronization because units survive together or not at all. None of that applied here. The situation below the hill had already stripped those principles of value. Movement meant death. Coordination meant predictability. Waiting meant survival, and survival was the only currency that mattered. He was not chosen because he was exceptional. In fact, the system had already categorized him as unremarkable. He did not move like a soldier shaped by drills and assault lanes. He moved like someone used to terrain that punished impatience. Years spent in mountains where noise scared game away, where rushing ruined the day, where success depended on understanding when not to move. Those habits were invisible to doctrine because doctrine does not measure patience. It measures results. This is where the mismatch began to matter. Instead of treating the machine guns as threats, he treated them as signals. Each burst was not danger, but data. The timing between bursts revealed rhythm. The traverse revealed expectation. The pauses revealed blind moments where the system assumed nothing would exist. He did not need the guns to stop firing. He only needed them to continue behaving exactly as designed. This is an uncomfortable idea for modern warfare. That a perfectly functioning system can be exploited precisely because it is functioning correctly. The guns were not sloppy. They were disciplined. They were predictable. And predictability, in this context, was lethal to the wrong side. Every decision he made reduced visibility rather than distance. Instead of measuring progress in meters, he measured it in seconds, survived without being detected. Instead of pushing toward objectives, he aligned himself with patterns. Where doctrine demanded urgency, he inserted delay. Where the battlefield rewarded momentum, he removed it entirely. From above, nothing appeared to change. The machine guns continued firing. The slope remained controlled. The attackers remained pinned. From below, nothing looked different either. Men still could not move. Commanders still waited for artillery. The system appeared stable because its outputs had not yet changed. But stability is not the same as security. At this stage, the outcome was not determined by firepower or numbers. It was determined by whether the system could recognize a threat that did not announce itself as one. And systems rarely do. They are built to defeat what they can measure: speed, mass, noise, motion. They struggle against what denies those inputs. The approach unfolded in fragments. Minutes stretched. Silence mattered. The distance between survival and exposure shrank to handspans and breath control. This was not combat as Doctrine defined it. It was intrusion, a slow violation of the battlefield's assumptions, a presence where absence was expected. What makes this phase critical is not what happened next, but what did not happen. No alarm was raised. No shift in fire occurred. No adjustment was made. The guns did not reorient because there was nothing, according to their logic, that required reorientation. The system was winning the fight it believed it was fighting. That belief would soon become fatal. Because once a system commits fully to one interpretation of reality, it loses the ability to detect alternatives. By the time evidence appears, response windows have already closed. On Hill 424, the window closed quietly, without drama, without warning, while the guns continued doing exactly what they were built to do. What followed would not be a test of bravery, but a test of whether Doctrine could adapt faster than a single human mind operating outside its rules. It could not. The collapse did not begin with noise. It began with misinterpretation. The first machine gun position was not destroyed because it was weak or poorly defended. It fell because it was never designed to defend against something that arrived without urgency. The crew behind the gun did everything correctly. Their bursts were timed. Their coverage was disciplined. Their attention remained fixed on the slope below, where danger was supposed to come from. This is the moment where Doctrine and reality finally separated. Crew-served weapons are trained to dominate space, not to monitor stillness. They suppress movement, not absence. A gunner does not search for what is not supposed to exist. He maintains fire where targets are expected to appear. That expectation is everything. On Hill 424, expectation became blindness. When the first position fell silent, the system did not immediately recognize it as a threat. It registered as an event, a noise, an explosion. Something had happened, but the logic of the battlefield still held. One gun lost did not mean the slope was compromised. It meant firepower would shift, which is exactly what happened. The second machine gun opened fire harder. This response felt logical. Increased suppression, where resistance might emerge, longer bursts, wider coverage, more noise, more dominance. From a doctrinal perspective, this was correct behavior. The system believed it was responding to pressure from below. It did not understand that pressure had come from inside. This is where the illusion of control reached its peak. The remaining positions did not scan for a human threat. They scanned for a unit. They did not imagine proximity. They imagined advance. Their response patterns were designed to punish groups, not individuals operating between assumptions. The more aggressively they fired downslope, the more certain they became that the danger was still where it belonged. Above them, daylight approached. This mattered more than anything else. Darkness had allowed deviation. Light would restore the system's advantage. Once visibility returned, the hillside would become legible again. Movement would be punished instantly. The system did not need to adapt if it could simply wait. But waiting required one thing the system no longer controlled: time. As the second position continued firing, it committed fully to a single narrative of the battlefield. Its back was turned to the slope behind it. Its attention was fixed forward. This was not negligence. It was efficiency. Cover the threat. Maintain suppression. Trust the overlapping fields of fire above. That trust was misplaced. The third position represented the final layer of the system's logic. It existed not to fight immediately, but to preserve dominance once the fight shifted. It was insurance, a reserve of violence designed to restore order if the lower guns were compromised. In theory, nothing should reach it without being seen, slowed, and destroyed long before that happened. In theory, What the system could not calculate was simultaneity created by delay. It assumed threats would appear sequentially, driven by momentum. It did not account for someone willing to pause an entire battlefield to realign geometry. When the second position was disrupted, the third responded as designed by suppressing space, not by securing proximity. This was the fatal error. The moment the third gun fired blindly, it surrendered its greatest advantage: awareness. Noise replaced observation. Violence replaced understanding. In trying to reassert control, it narrowed its perception to a single point of uncertainty, ignoring everything outside that cone. The system was now fighting itself. Every burst fired at empty ground confirmed the wrong interpretation. Every second spent suppressing nothing allowed the distance to close. By the time the final confrontation occurred, the system had already lost. Not tactically, but cognitively. It was reacting to a battlefield that no longer existed. What followed was not chaos. It was inevitability. Once proximity was achieved, Doctrine had nothing left to offer. Crew served weapons dominate at distance. At close range, they become anchors, fixed, slow, dependent on crew coordination. When that coordination breaks, the system collapses inward. This is why the final moments were brief. The guns did not fail because of poor marksmanship or lack of courage. They failed because the logic that made them powerful had reached the end of its usefulness. They were built to control movement, not to survive intrusion. Once intrusion occurred, there was no second layer of thought to fall back on. Below the hill, the battlefield changed without announcement. Fire slackened. Space opened. Men who had been pinned by an invisible wall suddenly found that wall gone. They did not know why. They only knew that something fundamental had shifted. Above them, the system no longer existed as a system. It existed only as disconnected reactions, each one arriving too late to matter. The collapse took less than an hour, but the assumptions that collapsed with it had been in place for decades. What matters next is not what was taken, but how briefly it mattered. The hillside changed hands, the guns went silent, and men who had expected to die stood up and moved forward. From the ground level, it felt like victory. From the operational level, it looked like success. The road inland opened. The crest was reached. Orders were executed. Reports were filed. But war does not measure outcomes the way soldiers experience them. Hill 424 did not decide the campaign. It did not alter the balance of power in Italy. It did not even remain in American hands for long. Within days, the ground would be contested again. More men would die retaking positions that had already been paid for in blood. From a strategic perspective, the result was temporary. From a historical perspective, it was barely a footnote. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because if the result was so fleeting, why does the moment matter at all? The answer lies in the difference between winning terrain and exposing logic. The guns were neutralized. The assault succeeded. But the real consequence did not exist on the map. It existed inside Doctrine, inside training manuals, inside the quiet recalculations of officers who understood what had just happened but could not fully explain it. What they saw was not heroism. Heroism explains nothing. What they saw was a system defeated without being overpowered. A defensive network built to dominate movement, undone by someone who refused to move the way the system demanded. This was not a new weapon. It was a new way of invalidating assumptions. That realization did not spread loudly. Armies do not advertise moments where doctrine fails. They absorb them. Strip away the individual. Remove the story. Reduce the event to mechanics and lessons. The hillside became a case study, not a legend. The name faded. The logic remained. This is why the outcome must be understood carefully. The victory did not lie in the capture of ground. It lay in the demonstration that ground could be captured differently. That artillery was not the only answer. That overwhelming force was not the sole solution. That, under certain conditions, initiative could replace mass, not by charging harder, but by thinking slower. At the same time, the limits were obvious. One man could break a system. He could not hold it. He could not sustain it. He could not prevent the larger machinery of war from grinding forward. Doctrine might bend, but strategy would not pause for reflection. Men would continue to advance into fire. Positions would be lost and retaken. Casualties would continue to accumulate. This tension is critical. If individual initiative is so powerful, why does war still rely on systems that erase individuals? Because initiative is unreliable. It cannot be scheduled. It cannot be standardized. It cannot be guaranteed. Systems exist precisely because they work most of the time, even when they fail catastrophically in rare moments. Hill 424 was one of those moments. The assault that followed succeeded with minimal loss. The men below advanced without paying the price Doctrine had predicted. For them, the result was immediate and personal. They lived. That alone made the difference matter. For the war, the effect was marginal. For the people who studied it afterward, it was unsettling, because it forced a question that Doctrine prefers not to ask. How many lives are lost not because systems fail, but because they work exactly as designed? The answer to that question would shape what came next. What endured was never meant to endure. The man disappeared back into the machinery of war almost immediately. Captured, listed incorrectly, forgotten. His name drifted out of operational memory, and for a long time, that seemed appropriate. Wars do not preserve individuals. They preserve patterns. What survives is not who did something, but what the system learned from it. And the system did learn, not publicly, not ceremonially, quietly, methodically. The hillside was stripped of emotion and reduced to diagrams. Distances were measured, timings were noted. The sequence of collapse was reconstructed without ever needing to mention the human who caused it. What mattered was not disobedience, but effect. Not bravery, but mechanics. Not courage, but geometry. In training rooms far from Italy, instructors did not tell the story as a miracle. They told it as a problem. How a fortified position failed without artillery. How overlapping fire did not guarantee control. How proximity negated superiority. The lesson was absorbed into Doctrine without fanfare. Because Doctrine does not celebrate, it corrects. Over time, those corrections reshaped how armies thought about reconnaissance, infiltration, and small unit initiative. Not as replacements for firepower, but as tools to fracture it. The idea that crews served weapons where the center of gravity remained. What changed was the understanding that centers of gravity could be approached indirectly, slowly, patiently, without announcing intent. The irony is that the man at the center of this lesson never sought to explain it. He never framed his actions as insight. He never described them as innovation. When recognition finally arrived decades later, it felt almost misplaced. The system had already taken what it needed. The human acknowledgement came long after the lesson had been institutionalized. This is where the story resists a clean ending, because it tempts us to conclude that individual initiative is the answer to mechanized war, that human thinking will always outmaneuver systems. That one person, acting differently, can break the logic of violence. Sometimes that is true. Often it is not. For every moment where Doctrine collapses, there are countless others where it functions exactly as intended, at a terrible cost. What Hill 424 reveals is not that systems are weak, but that they are fragile in specific ways. They are powerful against what they expect. They struggle against what they do not. And once they adapt, the window closes again. War evolves by consuming these moments. The lesson was never that one man mattered more than the war. It was that war, no matter how industrialized, still depends on assumptions about human behavior. And whenever those assumptions harden into certainty, they create blind spots. Blind spots where outcomes can flip, briefly, quietly, without warning. The hillside was taken, then lost, then fought over again. History moved forward, but embedded inside Doctrine, unseen by most, was the memory of a system that failed not because it was overwhelmed, but because it misunderstood the kind of human standing in front of it. That misunderstanding is never permanent. It waits for the next war, the next doctrine, the next moment when certainty becomes vulnerability, and the question that remains is not whether this will happen again. It is whether anyone will recognize it while it is happening.